Hi, this is Mr. Fernandez, and I'm here to tell you a little bit about the French and Dutch North American colonies from the early 1600s to the middle of the 1700s or so. Here are the learning targets for this first foray into actual American history in this course. There are three of them. The first one is by the end of this lecture, you should be able to explain how and why various European colonies, in particular the French and the Dutch, colonies, developed and expanded from 1607 to 1754. You should also be able to explain how and why interactions between various European nations and American Indians changed over time. So one of the things that we'll talk about is how the French and the Dutch dealt with Native Americans. And why. Finally, you should be able to compare the effects of the development of colonial society in the various regions of North America. So you should be able to take French, North America, the Dutch colonies, and then later on Spain and the British colonies, and compare and contrast them. How are they similar and how are they different? So these are the things that you should be able to do by the time you're done with this lecture. Now, this is what is known in APUSH as a key concept. You can go ahead and read that. And basically what this is the broad concepts that you are responsible for on the AP exam. You can find these in in the AP US History Handbook. A link to that is available on the course syllabus. You can also find them in the study guides for each unit. This is period 2 for AP US History. It's part of our Unit 1. And you can find a study guide for Unit 1 on ManageBac attached to the first test, the multiple choice exam. That's in late August. So have a look at ManageBac, find the test, download this study guide, and you'll see all the relevant key concepts for this unit, as well as study terms, key terms, and also learning targets, all listed there as well. That should be the most important thing that you use to study for this exam, and we'll remind you of that in class as well. This is a map. We may have given you a blank map for you to color in, so pause the video in a minute and go ahead and take your blank map and recreate these kind of general boundaries here. These are the places we'll be talking about in the next couple of days. You've already learned about Spanish North America, the parts of North America that Spain claimed. Here is French North America, the parts of North America that France claimed. The British would eventually claim all of this land here along the eastern seaboard. And here is Dutch North America, just a small part, mostly in what is today New York. So take a second. If you want to use colored pencils, that's fine, but you don't need to. And color in or recreate this map on your blank map. And then bring it with you to class tomorrow. You can start the video up again when you're done with that. Here, thank you for making that map. Here, by the way, is the map, a blow-up, close-up, rather, of the Dutch colonies. Notice how it's really just tiny slivers of New York, Manhattan Island down here, parts of what is now Long Island, etc., etc. A very small piece of North America by text message. Okay, so here we go. Starting with the French. New France. New France, of course, was all this blue shaded area here. It started in 1608 when Samuel de Champlain established Quebec, the first permanent French settlement in North America. The French went on to claim most of the Mississippi River Basin and all the way down to what is today New Orleans, and named it Louisiana in 1682. So that's all this blue stuff here, where in today's United States. The main French goal, why the French came to America, is important because it had a huge impact on how the French society, colonial society, developed. Whereas the Spanish came to conquer as much land as they could, to do a bunch of things aside from converting Native Americans, to grabbing as much gold and silver as they could find, which they could in parts of South America and Central America, to creating huge farms and and ranches to produce natural resources, or to produce goods that could be sold back in Europe and maintain a large colonial presence. The French goal was different because of where they landed. The French ended up, mostly inland in this area here in the Great Lakes region. So not a whole lot of opportunity to trade in large numbers back with Europe. Also, the very cold up here, so not a very inviting atmosphere or climate, especially for agriculture, the kind of agriculture that might be profitable. So the biggest thing that the French did economically was the fur trade. Europeans loved furs from little tiny furry animals like this little whatchamacallit, beaver. And there was lots of them in the Great Lakes region. So more than anything, New France was a fur trading colonial venture. There was comparatively little migration from France. Only 15,000 people lived in New France by 1690. That's, compares to 250,000 people in the British colonies. And there were far more trading outposts than there were, farms. As a result of this, so the economic motives and activities of the French had an effect on their relationship with the Native Americans. The Spanish were all about converting the Native Americans at all costs and using them for labor, right? That's part of the reason for the encomienda system, for example. To extract mineral wealth like gold and silver, to farm, to raise livestock and things like that, to get as much natural wealth as possible. The Spanish could do that because they had a sizable, population in the Americas, depending on the colony. The French had a small presence in New France, and that's for one thing. And secondly, their primary activity was fur trading. So killing the Native Americans was a bad idea. They're the ones who did all the hunting for furs, and without them, they couldn't have a fur trade. So in New France, what you see is very different from the Spanish Empire. You see a lot of cooperation between the French and Native Americans. You see the French adopting Algonquian-speaking people's languages and some of their cultural practices. The French figured out what were their rituals involved in trading things with Native Americans, so that they could have a good relationship with the people that they're trading with. The Native Americans also saw the French as less of a threat and more of more like trading partners. And so they adopted the French language. They can talk to their, trading partners. They adopted French cultural elements. And there was kind of like a middle ground formed in the Great Lakes region. A new culture, you might say, or some historians have said, that blended French and Native American language and cultural elements. Because neither side tried to kill each other, as their primary goal, they accommodated to each other and created a distinct culture in the Great Lakes region. That's very different from Spain, right, which wanted to kill all Native Americans or use them for labor, or force them to convert to Christianity. Very different from the British, as you'll see, or you've already seen in your reading. So, that's important to note. Different cultures, different goals yield different results in the colonial period. This, intermingling between the French and the Native Americans led to interracial romantic relations and lots of childbearing of children of mixed parentage, Native American and French. It also meant that the French efforts at converting Native Americans to Catholicism were also different from the Spanish, for example. Again, the Spanish would force Native Americans to move into mission towns and force them to adopt European clothes, force them to speak Spanish, force them to worship a certain way. The French, because they had the power and the numbers to do that. The French didn't have the numbers to do that, and they wanted to maintain peaceful relations with Native Americans generally, and so the French, Christian missionaries, Catholic Jesuit missionaries, they were very different. They lived among the Native Americans. They often, were very flexible in the kind of Catholicism that they preached, that, incorporating some Native American elements, and were less forceful about it because they couldn't be, and B, the other French folks didn't want them to be that way because that would alienate their primary trading partners. Finally, the political system of New France was simple. The French king ruled over all of New France and called all the shots. He had representatives here in New France, but ultimately he made all the decisions. It was a direct rule by the French king. Similar to the Spanish system, in which there were Spanish royal representatives in the colonies, in Spanish colonies, but ultimately the king and queen, or whoever was in charge up there in Spain, called all the shots. Then there's New Netherland, the Dutch colony, which was located here in today's New York along the Hudson River, and pieces of today's Long Island and Manhattan, and parts of what are today New Jersey. The New Netherlands colony was established by Henry Hudson, who claimed modern-day New York for the Dutch in 1609. By 1624, a private company, the Dutch West India Company, had established the city of New Amsterdam in what is today New York, Manhattan Island. What were their motives? Again, because that matters, right? It has a lot to do with how the colony ends up developing. The Dutch were all about undermining the Spanish. The Netherlands back in Europe and Spain had a very intense rivalry because Spain had once conquered the Netherlands, which they called the Low Country, and the Dutch had won their independence from Spain in a war not too long before this. And the Spanish had become powerful because of all of the land they had acquired in the Americas. And the French, the British, and the Dutch, for sure, were all about trying to get in on that action, but also prevent the Spanish from getting even stronger by conquering more lands in North America. So the Dutch government gave a monopoly to a corporation, a company, the Dutch West India Company, to keep whatever profit it made by doing whatever it took to keep the Spaniards from gaining more power. The Dutch West India Company used that license, if you will, to establish New Netherland in the city of New Amsterdam as a way of keeping the Spanish from taking that same land. And they had an economic motive to do that. They would keep all the profit from doing that. So the Dutch government encouraged the Dutch West India Company to settle in North America. What was the main profit source? Well, like with the French, the main profit source was the fur trade with Native Americans. Later on, some agriculture and some lumber camps emerged, but the fur trade was the most important thing. Let's skip that. Now, what was the society like in New Netherland? Well, it was kind of difficult attracting settlers and workers, especially laborers, to New Netherland. They only had a population of 9,000 people in the colony in 1664 when the British took it over. You'll see that later. So, because of this small number of settlers and because of the need for labor to build buildings, to to trade with Native Americans, to build ships, to farm, they brought in the Dutch. The Dutch were the first to bring in large-ish numbers Africans who were forced to migrate to North America, beginning in 1626. And soon thereafter, it became the largest urban enslaved population in North America, the city in North America with the largest enslaved population. It was also the city with the most diverse European settlement in North America. Look at all these people who came to New Netherlands. Swedish people, Norwegian people, Spanish people, etc., etc., etc. Why? Well, because the colony guaranteed political rights. That's its second bullet point, including religious freedom. And that's huge. It needed to do that in order to attract people to the colony. There was a lot of religious turmoil in Europe. There were a lot of places in Europe, most countries in Europe, most governments in Europe had one formal or official church. And you had to belong to that church. If you didn't, you sucked and you were persecuted. And the Netherlands New Netherland was different. People could practice whatever religion they wanted to, especially Christian church. They could belong to whatever Christian church they wanted to. That was huge. And that attracted all of these people from all these different places in Europe who were persecuted back home for their religious beliefs. Aside from that, the political situation in New Netherland was that it was under the complete control of governors who were appointed by the Dutch West India Company. So the company was the one that ran the government, was the government of the colony, and their representative was the governor who called all the shots. Finally, New Netherland was not to be after 1664. Great Britain was growing in its power in North America, and by 1664 it had enough power to force the Dutch to surrender New Netherland to Great Britain, to the British Crown. The colony became New York when it changed hands. The city of New Amsterdam was renamed New York City, but the people who lived in New Netherland, as a condition of their surrender, would keep a lot of the rights that they had under the Dutch West India Company, and that includes religious freedom. That's rare. It's going to be a weird, outlier in the British North American colonies, where religious freedom is not going to be the name of the game. You'll see that later. Well, you've already seen that already in the readings. And so from the very start, New York is this place of freedom in a lot of ways, and diversity in a lot of ways too. And that freedom, of course, did not apply to people who were enslaved, who were of African descent. So let's keep that in mind too. Freedom for Europeans, we should say. Okay, so that's